As I searched the life of my namesake, I learned about files, the making of which that gentleman of almost 180 years ago made his living. And I begin by quoting from various internet sources.
But few tools can lay claim to as great antiquity as the file. So very old is it, indeed, that no mention can be found in either profane or sacred history of its invention, for it antedates written history. But in the Bible, in 2 Samuel, the 13th chapter and the 21st verse, is to be found the following. Yet they had a file for the mattocks, and for the coulters, and for the forks, and for the axes, and to sharpen the goads. This was 1100 years before the advent of the Christian era, and there is every reason to believe that the file was in use before this time.
That's the end of that quote. Files were first made from stone, then copper, bronze, and finally iron. In the never-ending quest to make life better, it was learned that iron could be refined, combined with other materials, and tempered. In probably the 1500s, the prototype of the modern file was first developed. Blacksmiths formed iron into shapes we would recognize today, then annealed the blank, which softened the iron so it could be cut by a hardened chisel, and turned it over to, voila, a file cutter. After cutting, the new file was carefully, so as not to blunt the new teeth, turned over to a craftsman who had the skill and resources to harden the steel. This illustration shows a medieval file maker's workshop in which the techniques used are very similar to those in commercial use up to the mid-1800s. The man on the left is hardening and tempering the files in a furnace, while the man on the right is cutting the teeth. Now let's take a look at the file cutter occupation, which became a recognized trade. In 1800, there were more than 2,000 members of the File Cutter Guild. Note in the picture the file cutter over the anvil, an anvil mounted on a very heavy base, and the words from an old account of the trade.
They are now ready for the cutter, who sits astride a bench in front of the block or anvil across which rests the file. It is held firmly in place by a strap across either end, into the lower loops of which are placed the cutter's feet, like stirrups, the weight of the legs thus firmly holding the bar in place. The tang, the part to be inserted into the handle, points toward him, and, after slightly greasing the blank, he is ready to cut the teeth. In his left hand he holds a small chisel, the edge of which always exceeds the width of the file, and placing it on the blank with an inclination of from 40 degrees to 55 degrees, according to the character of the file to be made, he gives it a sharp blow with the hammer in his right hand. An indentation in the farthest or the small end of the file, and thus made, the indentation naturally inclining toward him. This, of course, leaves a ridge, or a tooth, slightly thrown up above the surface, and, following this as a guide, he places his chisel alongside of it and strikes another blow with his hammer, and this is continued until the teeth are cut the full length of the face of the blank.
Tedious drudgery, 10 to 12 hours a day, inhaling dust from the lead bed on which the file is worked. Lead poisoning is common in the trade. The British Medical Journal of 1850 described and decried the health hazards of the occupation. They even called it the file cutter's disease.
An average workman will strike from 60 to 80 of these blows per minute. All this time the file is resting on a thin sheet of pewter, or a bed of pewter and lead mixed together, so that the opposite side of the file will not be injured. Here we can see the shape of the teeth cut by the chisel. When cut by machine, the spacing of the teeth is set automatically, but in hand cutting, this is governed by a force of the blow given to the chisel. After each cut, the chisel is raised, moved onto the uncut metal to the left of this illustration, and slid back along the work until it meets the back of the previous tooth. It is then struck again with the hammer to form the next tooth. Obviously, if the chisel is struck harder, it will cut a deeper groove, which will also be correspondingly wider, and so, for a file of even pitch and roughness, it was important that the hand file makers develop the skill to make every blow of the hammer the same.
Beside the not mind-numbing tedium, how about arthritis? 60 to 80 blows per minute for 10 hours, 6 days a week, year-round, for 30 years? I don't think many of us would be interested. But these horners followed this trade for at least 3 generations. The same number of generations later-day horners were farmers. Now let's look at these 19th century horners individually, and some of this is fact, some I have extrapolated from those facts, and some of it will be pure speculation. Oh, how I would love to ask more questions. You were baptized, married in a church. Did you attend worship regularly? Did you ponder eternal questions of life, death, immortality? If you went to school, what did you study? Tell me about your childhood, your friends. How old were you when you were apprenticed to your trade? Did your father decide when and to what trade that was? I was overwhelmed by my desire to know the warp and woof of their lives, and I fear we will never have the answer to those questions.